Well, we were just sitting there with our signs that said, like, we love Sophie, like, thank you, Sophie, for speaking up. And so we were holding them, just watching the game. Again, like, we were being super great. We hadn't said anything to anyone else. We were being super respectful. We were just holding our signs and cheering for both teams. And this lady, older lady, comes up to us. And she comes up to us, and at first I think she's going to be nice. And then she asks, like, what are you guys doing? Something like that. And then it was like, Jesus loves everyone. That's what she told us. And
A teenage girl walked into a basketball arena with a sign. She wasn't causing a scene, she wasn't screaming at anyone, she wasn't blocking anyone's view or starting arguments with the people around her. She was just a kid who admired a player and wanted to say thank you. By the time the night was over, a co-owner of the home team had screamed at her in front of thousands of people. Security had been called, and that same teenage girl was sitting in her seat in tears before the altercation had even fully ended. That's not a rumor. That's not something that got twisted on basketball Twitter before anyone had the full story. That's what actually happened inside Climate Pledge Arena in Seattle. And the more you dig into the details of that night, the worse it gets. Because this story isn't really about one incident at one game. It's about what that incident reveals about the current state of a league that has spent years telling the world it stands for inclusion, tolerance, and the protection of women, and then watched one of its co-owners scream at a child for holding a sign that agreed with exactly that. To understand why that night in Seattle happened, you have to go back a few weeks. And to understand why those few weeks unfolded the way they did, you have to understand who Sophie Cunningham actually is. Because a lot of people who suddenly have very strong opinions about her don't actually know much about her beyond the last month. Sophie Cunningham is not Caitlin Clark. She's not the reason people are buying tickets or tuning in to Fever games in record numbers. She would probably be the first person to tell you that. What she is, though, is the player who has Clark's back more consistently and more vocally than anyone else on that roster. She's the one who shows up for Clark when the officiating gets inconsistent. She's the one who positions herself between Clark and whoever seems to be making the game more physical than it needs to be. She's the enforcer in the best sense of the word, not because she's looking for conflict, but because she genuinely doesn't back down when something feels wrong. Off the court, she's operated the same way for most of her career. She's not someone who has spent years building a political brand or chasing controversy for attention. She doesn't have a history of inflammatory takes or calculated media moments. What she does have is a clear sense of what she believes, and apparently no particular interest in hiding it when someone asks her directly.
Seattle Storm situation is going very south fast. Now we have other big-time business people being accused and caught on film harassing Indiana Fever fans, and these young ladies held a rally for anti-trans. Now during this rally, nothing happened. It was calm. But the Seattle Storm co-owner, who has now been suspended, by the way, we're going to talk.
That combination, being outspoken without being performative, is rarer than people realize, especially in professional sports, where the default setting for most athletes when a sensitive question arrives is to deflect it cleanly and move on. Sophie Cunningham didn't do that, and that decision, made in a feature interview on ESPN of all places, is what set off the chain of events that ended with a teenager crying in a sold-out arena in Seattle. The moment itself wasn't dramatic. There was no build-up, no warning that the conversation was about to shift into territory that would dominate sports media for the next several weeks. A reporter asked Sophie Cunningham directly, and without much preamble, about her views on transgender athletes competing in women's sports. It was a straightforward question, the kind that gets asked and then carefully avoided on a daily basis across professional sports. Cunningham didn't avoid it. She said she believes in protecting young girls in locker rooms. She said she doesn't think biological males should be competing against biological females in women's sports. She said she feels strongly about Title IX and what it was designed to protect, and she connected it directly to why women's sports exist at all. Because without protection, you don't get the Brittney Griners or the Caitlin Clarks or the generations of female athletes who came before them. She was composed, she was clear. She wasn't shouting and she wasn't performing outrage. She was just answering the question she was asked. And then she said something that a lot of people seemed to gloss over in the weeks that followed. She said she doesn't hate anyone. She said she extends love to everyone. She said she genuinely believes there is space for every person, and she has never once claimed otherwise. What she won't do, what she made absolutely clear she will not do, is change that belief simply because a group of people wants her to. Think about how unusual that actually is. In modern professional sports, the standard playbook when an athlete says something that generates backlash is well established. You wait 48 hours, you let your PR team craft something that softens the original statement without directly contradicting it. You go back in front of a microphone and you say something along the lines of, "I want to clarify what I meant," which translated from athlete speak means, "I want to walk this back far enough that people stop being angry without me having to admit I'm doing exactly that." It happens constantly. It's practically a formula at this point. Sophie Cunningham didn't use the formula. When reporters came back to her days later, clearly hoping she'd give them something they could use to reframe the original interview as a misunderstanding, she said it again, almost word for word. She added that she holds no hatred in her heart for anyone, and that she thinks love is the right response to everyone. But on the core of what she said, she didn't move an inch. That's not what chasing attention looks like. That's what actually believing something looks like. What happened after that interview moved fast, faster, honestly, than almost anyone expected for a comment made by someone who, before all of this, most casual sports fans couldn't have picked out of a lineup. Within 2 days, USA Today had picked up the story. ESPN was running segments on it across multiple shows. Fox News gave it its own dedicated national segment. The White House press secretary officially stated that Sophie Cunningham was on the right side of a debate that the majority of Americans already agree with her on. Read that again. A WNBA role player answered one honest question in one feature interview, and within 48 hours it had become a national conversation with the White House weighing in. That doesn't happen because one athlete said something mildly interesting. That happens because the question she answered has been sitting underneath the surface of American sports for years, building pressure, and Sophie Cunningham happened to be the person standing over it when it finally came through. The response was all over the map. There were people who couldn't applaud her enough. Commentators, fans, former athletes who argued that what she said was simply common sense and that the backlash against her was proof of a suffocating double standard in how these conversations are allowed to happen. There were others who accused her of targeting the trans community, of using a sports platform to push a political agenda, of causing harm to people who are already vulnerable. The internet did what the internet does, which is take a nuanced position and compress it into the most polarizing version of itself as quickly as possible. Back in the WNBA, the reaction was more pointed and more personal. When the Fever played the Seattle Storm, some fans in the arena booed Cunningham when she checked into the game. One Storm player showed up to the arena before tip-off wearing a shirt that read, "Trans rights are human rights." The message was clear, and nobody pretended it wasn't directed at what Cunningham had said. After the game, Storm head coach Sonia Rahman was asked about the situation and gave the kind of carefully worded answer that tells you a great deal about what an organization wants to project, even when it's telling you almost nothing specific. She talked about Seattle being a place where everyone feels welcome. She talked about the arena being an inclusive space. She didn't mention Sophie Cunningham by name. She didn't mention the fans who'd come to support her. She spoke in the language of organizational messaging, which is to say she said everything and nothing at the same time. And underneath all of that, one name kept surfacing in conversations that Cunningham herself never started. Brittney Griner didn't say publicly that Sophie Cunningham's comments were directed at her. She didn't have to.
The WNBA fan base doesn't need a translator for this kind of thing, and by the time the Fever and the Storm met on the court, the subtext had become about as subtle as a technical foul. For 3 seasons now, the relationship between Griner and Caitlin Clark on the court has been a source of ongoing tension that the league has handled with varying degrees of consistency. There have been body checks that went uncalled. There was a bench moment from the previous season that fans are still dissecting frame by frame, trying to figure out exactly what was said and whether the officiating response made any sense. There has been a persistent pattern, at least in the eyes of a significant portion of the fan base, of the game being called differently when Clark and Griner are sharing the floor, and not in a way that favors Clark. Into all of that walks Sophie Cunningham, Clark's closest teammate and the person most willing to get between Clark and whatever's making the game harder for her. She gets asked about transgender athletes in sports, she gives a clear answer, and the fan base, already primed by months of watching these two teams play each other, immediately connects the dots. Cunningham, to her credit, never named Griner. She never implied she was talking about Griner. She spoke in general terms about a policy position she holds, and when people pushed her on who exactly she meant, she said she holds love for everyone, and left it there.
But Griner herself, in a separate interview that came out just a few days before all of this exploded, mentioned that playing against Cunningham is incredibly frustrating. She didn't elaborate. She didn't have to. The timing of that comment, sitting alongside everything else, did its own work. Make of all that what you will, but it's worth noting that the question of whether Cunningham's ESPN remarks were intended as a message to any specific person has never actually been directly addressed by Griner. That's a silence with weight to it, even if nobody is entirely sure what it means. What is certain is that by the time the Fever made the trip to Seattle, this had moved far beyond a post-game interview. It was a flashpoint, and the arena in Seattle was about to become the place where it stopped being an online argument and became something that happened to real people in real time. On paper, the Fever's road game against the Storm on Tuesday night should have been a basketball game, just a basketball game. 2 teams with playoff implications, a sold-out arena, and a crowd that came out to watch athletes compete. That's what it should have been. What it actually was something more complicated from the moment people started arriving outside Climate Pledge Arena before tip-off. A group had gathered outside, not a massive crowd, but a visible one, representing people who had come specifically because of what Sophie Cunningham had said and what it represented in a broader conversation. Some of them wore clothing bearing XX and XY symbols. Some carried signs. Some were there in support of a Washington state ballot initiative that had been gaining traction regarding equity in girls' athletics. It wasn't a single-issue demonstration with a single unified message. It was a collection of people who felt that a conversation they cared about was being played out in this specific arena on this specific night, and they wanted to be present for it. 2 of those people made their way inside and took their seats courtside. One of them was a teenage girl. She had traveled a significant distance to be there, reportedly all the way from California, because she wanted to show support for Sophie Cunningham. She and her companion were holding a banner. The banner expressed gratitude to Cunningham for speaking up for girls. It didn't mention any Storm players, it didn't make any accusations, it didn't use any inflammatory language. It was a thank you sign for a visiting player, held by a fan who had paid for her seat and was, by every account from people who were seated around her, behaving completely respectfully. No arguments, no confrontations, no disruptions, just watching the game and holding a sign. That's when a woman approached them. The girl described it afterward in terms that made it clear she had no idea what was coming. The woman approached them and initially seemed like she might just be curious. Then, according to the girl's account, the woman told them that Jesus loves everyone, which the girl said she agrees with, noting that she is religious herself. Then the tone shifted. The woman told them she hoped Jesus could forgive them for the sin they'd committed. And then, in front of thousands at a professional basketball game, she called them effing insane and told them to stop what they were doing and put the sign away.
The woman was later identified by people in the audience as Celeste Catone, a minority co-owner of the Seattle Storm. Security was called, the fans were removed from their seats, and the teenage girl who had traveled from California to hold a thank you sign at a basketball game was left in tears. Brandy Cruz of Undivided Pod, who spoke with them directly afterward, confirmed that the girl was visibly crying when she came over to check on her. The girl herself said she had been yelled at online before and had developed a reasonably thick skin about it. That's just the internet, and she understood that. But this was different. This was an adult, in person, at full volume, in a public space, getting in her face in a way she hadn't anticipated and couldn't process quickly enough to not be shaken by it. Nobody around them spoke up. Nobody seated nearby intervened. The people who witnessed it happen in real time, in a sold-out arena, stayed quiet while a co-owner of the home team dressed down a teenage fan for holding a sign that said thank you.
The story moved quickly once it got out. Within a day or so, the details were circulating widely, and the WNBA had a situation on its hands that wasn't going away on its own. The league acted. Celeste Catone was fined and suspended from attending the next 5 home games of the Seattle Storm. That was the official consequence, and by the standards of how these things typically get handled in professional sports, it was a reasonably fast response. Then came the statement from Jenny Gilder, the Storm's majority owner. It acknowledged that a co-owner had made remarks to 2 fans. It expressed that everyone who attends a Storm game deserves to feel welcome regardless of what they believe. It offered an apology. Read it carefully, though, and notice everything it doesn't say. It doesn't name Celeste Catone. It doesn't describe what Catone actually said to those fans. It doesn't explain why a co-owner felt entitled to approach paying customers over a sign in the first place. It doesn't address the fact that a player on the same team showed up pre-game in a shirt making a political statement from the opposite direction and received nothing but appreciation for it. It doesn't explain the asymmetry. It doesn't ask the obvious question, which is, if everyone deserves to feel welcome regardless of what they believe, then why was a teenager who believed that Sophie Cunningham deserves to be thanked treated like a threat by someone with ownership stake in the building? The statement did exactly what statements like this are designed to do. It acknowledged enough to take the immediate heat off and simultaneously said nothing that could be used to hold anyone specifically accountable for anything specific. It's the organizational equivalent of a non-apology, technically responsive, carefully constructed, and almost completely empty of actual substance. It closed nothing, it resolved nothing. It just put a lid on the story long enough to hope that news cycles would eventually move on. Here's the thing that keeps coming back when you look at all of this laid out together. A Storm player wears a shirt that takes a clear political position on the same issue at the center of this entire controversy. She wears it to a game. She wears it in full view of the crowd, the cameras, the opposing team, and the league. The response from the organization is silence, which in this context is the same thing as approval. No co-owner approaches her, no security is called. She wears the shirt and nothing happens, because in this arena, on this issue, that particular position is the acceptable one. A teenager holds a sign thanking a player for expressing the opposite position. She holds it quietly, she doesn't confront anyone, she doesn't disrupt the game. She just holds the sign and watches basketball. And a co-owner comes down, calls her insane, invokes religion as a weapon against her, and has her removed from her seat. That asymmetry is the story. Not the incident by itself, not the statement, not even the fine and the suspension, as much as those things matter. The story is that inside that arena, on that night, the tolerance that the organization publicly claims to champion was entirely directional. It flowed one way, it covered one side of the argument, and a teenage girl found out which side she was on when a grown adult with partial ownership of the building decided to make that very clear to her. Step back for a moment and look at Sophie Cunningham's actual role in all of this. She answered a question. She was asked directly about her views on transgender athletes in women's sports, and she gave an honest, composed answer.
She didn't go hunting for controversy. She didn't release a statement or schedule a press conference or call a reporter to make sure her position got out there. She answered the question she was asked in the interview she was already giving, and she told the truth about what she believes. When the pressure came, and it came hard, and it came fast, she didn't fold. She went back in front of cameras and microphones and said essentially the same thing again, with the same clarity and the same emphasis on the fact that her position comes from a place of love for women and girls rather than hatred for anyone. She didn't give the league or the media or her critics the walkback they were looking for. She stayed where she was. That's it. That's the whole of what she did. And what it cost her, what it cost the fans who supported her, was a story about a teenager being yelled at by ownership in a sold-out arena. A teenager who did nothing except agree with her. A teenager who, by every account, was behaving exactly the way you're supposed to behave at a basketball game.
Sophie Cunningham didn't put that girl in that situation. The co-owner, who decided to make a political statement by confronting a paying customer, did that. But it's worth sitting with the fact that this is what happened as a downstream consequence of one honest answer to one fair question. A player told the truth, and a kid ended up in tears at a game she saved up to attend. There's a version of this story where you can argue about the specifics endlessly. You can debate whether Cunningham's remarks were appropriately framed. You can debate whether the fans who came to Seattle were primarily there to support her or primarily there to make a point about a much larger political battle. You can debate whether the league's response was proportionate or whether a 5-game suspension for a co-owner means anything real in the long run. Those debates are real and they're not going away. But strip all of that away, and what you're left with is something that doesn't require any particular political position to recognize as wrong. A team co-owner confronted a teenage fan at a professional basketball game because of a sign. The sign wasn't threatening, it wasn't targeting anyone by name, it wasn't obscene. It expressed gratitude to an athlete. A grown adult with financial ownership of the home team decided that this sign was a problem and went to deal with it personally, loudly, aggressively, and in front of thousands of witnesses, and the result was a child in tears. That's not a complicated story. That's not one where both sides have an equally valid point. Whatever you believe about the underlying issue, whatever your position is on the debate that started with Sophie Cunningham's ESPN interview, a co-owner of a professional sports team should not be screaming at teenagers over signs at basketball games. Full stop. The fact that it happened, the fact that in a sold-out arena full of adults, not a single person in the immediate vicinity stepped in to say something, tells you more about the current atmosphere inside parts of this league than any press release or carefully worded apology ever could. And the fact that the organization's statement in response managed to apologize without actually explaining, to acknowledge without actually accounting, and to promise inclusion without actually examining which direction that inclusion flows in, that tells you something too. Sophie Cunningham didn't ask for any of this. She answered a question and stood behind her answer. The rest of it happened around her, to her fans, in a building she was playing in while all of it unfolded. She played her game, she said what she believed, and somewhere in the stands, a teenage girl who agreed with her was learning in the most direct way possible what that kind of agreement costs in certain spaces. The question this whole situation leaves behind isn't really about Sophie Cunningham or Celeste Catone or the Seattle Storm or even the WNBA specifically. It's a simpler question, and it's the kind that tends to stay with you after the news cycle moves on and the suspension is served and the statement gets archived. When a league that says it stands for the protection of women watches one of its co-owners silence a teenage girl for thanking a player who said she wants to protect women, what exactly is being protected? Leave that one with yourself.